I looked up curiosity porn this afternoon, and you're not the first hit.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy.
James, something occurred to me today.
What's that?
Well, that we can say something on the podcast we've never been able to say before.
What is that?
You and I are now both in school.
That is true. That is correct. Of course, I'm hopefully at the end of mine.
Yeah.
You're kind of at the beginning of a new journey, right?
Yes, you have how many days until you are needing to turn in a dissertation?
12 is the countdown.
12 days till you turn in a dissertation.
Right.
I am in week number 4 of a brand new master's program.
I don't know what possessed you to do that. But
well, I mean, that's a long story too.
It is.
I think, you have never quite copped to this, but I think a lot of us get into academia because we really just wanted to be students the rest of our lives anyway, like get to learn whatever we wanted to learn. And let's just say I got really curious about psychology, and I'm starting to work on that a little bit.
All right. Well, I think that's right. You know, I love being in the classroom. I love bantering ideas back and forth. So, and when I got into it, I told you this before, when I got into it, I just kind of fell backwards into this. And it was mainly, I'll do this till I figure out what I really want to do. And 10 years in, I haven't figured out what I want to do more than this. So here I am.
Yeah, this is definitely what I want to do. Can we also celebrate a professional victory? I think it's worth noting.
What's that?
That we had a guest on the podcast many, many months ago, very early on.
Yes.
Michael Munger. And we just had him on campus to give some talk.
That's right.
And I would say it was a great success.
I would say so.
He was a super interesting guy. He presents very well. And that even made me all the more like people should go check out his work. It's really good.
And he was very, very generous with his time.
Very generous with his time.
And we're going to have another one on later this month.
That is
campus,
correct.
Right? So,
let's not jinx it since it hasn't happened yet. I don't know that. I mean, something could happen to where it doesn't work out the way that we want. But yes, we are planning to have another podcast guest on campus.
So, Dr. Best, just a warning. You're on the podcast. It could be that we ensnare you, but get on our campus some point in the future.
You just let the cat out of the bag. We haven't even introduced him yet. Because I was going to say, you and I talked a long time ago when we were talking about how's the podcast going or whatever. Mm-hmm. We asked the question, who would our dream guest be? You and I both took dream very literally.
Yes.
We both mentioned people who are deceased. You said James Madison, right?
Yes.
I said either Nat King Cole or Ella Fitzgerald, which was a curveball because it's not at all related to philosophy or politics or history or anything like that. But I said this when you were gone and Jerry pinch hitted for you. I told him like, okay, if I really had to pick people that, no, we legitimately could get them. We've already had one of my like top 5 guests of all time. Mm-hmm. That was Elizabeth Loftus. That was a bucket list interview for me. Today is absolutely one of my top 5 gets.
There you go.
And so I'm ecstatic that we have Joel Best, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Delaware. Dr. Best specializes in deviance. And first of all, isn't that just cool that a sociology can just say, like, I just specialize in deviance? You know, that already sounds really
so
edgy.
Wrong.
Yeah. Deviance and social problems. He's the author of over a dozen books concerning social problems, moral panics, and statistical literacy. Dr. Best, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
This is going to be exciting.
I think so. Yeah. I think so.
All right. So we have just a couple of kind of get to know you questions that we will throw out at you. The first one is, how did you get into academia?
I was planning to do this when I was in junior high school. I figured out really early on that I was real good at reading and not good at sports.
It's hard same, sir. Very, very same. I also would like to know about your path a little bit, though, too. So did you just go like straight from a PhD program to University of Delaware? Like, what was your...
Oh, no. I started teaching in 1969, and I was 23 years old. And I was getting an occupational deferment for the draft. And I taught for a year at Concordia College, which was a little school in Moorhead, Minnesota, that not coincidentally was in the same state as my draft board. And then they had the lottery that fall, and I won the lottery, but I'd given up my fellowship. So I went to California State University, Fresno, and I was there for 20 years. And then I moved to Southern Illinois at Carbondale, and I was there for 8 years. And then I got hired at Delaware.
Wow, nice. Do you know we have colleagues at UCO who were PhD'd from Illinois Carbondale?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they apparently have a good philosophy program. I didn't know that. Yeah. Okay, what is one interesting thing you are currently reading, listening to, or watching? Your pick.
Well, right now I'm reading Mary Roach's new book, Replaceable You, which is about artificial organs and still installing artificial organs in people. And I like Mary Roach. She writes kind of pop science, and she's very entertaining.
I am fascinated by that, the development of artificial organs. So that seems like that could be a huge kind of life-saving, life-changing technology if we get it right.
Yeah. Clearly, this is someplace off in the future, but yeah.
Sure, right. Who, in your opinion, is the greatest sociologist of all time?
Well, I have a very boring answer, Max Weber.
That's it, huh?
That's good, though. I like Weber. He counts. Yeah, no.
All right, should we get into the meat of it?
Yes, let's do. All right. So your most recent book is entitled Just the Facts, Untangling Contradictory Claims. Before we dive into some of the details, can you tell us about its origins? What was your inspiration or motivation for writing the book? How did that genesis begin?
Yeah, this has been true for a number of books. I just sort of sit in the world and I listen to what people are upset about. And a lot of times you can write a book about that. And, it occurred to me that there was a whole lot of conversations where people were pounding the table and screaming the word fact. And it seemed to me that might be interesting. And I thought, gee, I don't think sociologists have written a lot about facts. And aside from people talking about Emile Durkheim, who coined an expression that is translated as social fact, there really hasn't been anybody writing about it. And I thought, I could do that. And that would be interesting and fun.
Well, and people tend to have a view that facts are things that are in some sense innately or inherently true, regardless of what anyone thinks about them. Facts are in some sense just out there and we discover them. But you write that even things like what day it is and what time of day it is, these are ultimately a matter of a bunch of people agreeing about what's true or not. Can you explain that?
Yeah, all facts are social constructions. It makes people unhappy to hear that. And partly that's because sociologists originated the term social construction. We own the title on it, but it's migrated across the academy, and it has taken on, people understand the term to mean some sort of extreme relevantism, all claims are equally valid, et cetera, which is not what sociologists mean. What sociologists mean is that we can only understand the world through language. And language is a social product, and and different places have different languages, and they identify different things in the world as meaningful and so on. Every time that we say something, we're involved in an act of social construction. It's obviously the case that the date and the time of day are social constructions. I mean, we know that the calendar has histories, clocks have histories. There isn't something in nature that says there are 12 months or 24 hours in the day. We have just realized that it would be very useful if people all around the world use the same systems for reckoning the passage of time. And so we've done that. And I read something that apparently Iran is using a different calendar, but I think pretty much everybody else has bought into the European calendar that we all use.
No, I just go. So are there some? So I'm thinking, yes, calendars, days, time, all of that you can easily see as being socially constructed.
Gravity.
Gravity, I have a little bit harder time. So, if I hold something up and I let it go, it's going to drop, right?
I absolutely agree. And I think that probably every culture throughout history has taught, young people, don't hold rocks over your toes and let go, because it's going to fall down and it'll hurt. But the conception of gravity, defining it, remember in the good old days, there was, there were various theories about why do things fall down? Is it being pushed down? Is God pushing it down? Why is it falling? And Newton tells us, well, no, it's the relative mass of objects, and they attract one another and all that kind of stuff. And that's a social construction. Now, it's a really good social construction. We're able to send rockets with robots to Mars and land them on Mars and have them prowl around on the surface of the planet. I think, our understanding of gravity is really, really quite good. And I doubt that in 100 years or 1,000 years, people are going to be thinking about gravity in radically different ways than we do right now. But, there was a process. We credit Newton with noticing the apple falling out of the tree and all that kind of stuff, right? So gravity has a history. It's I have no doubt that it was always there. I don't doubt that there's a material world, but how we make sense of that world is absolutely a product of social activity. We talk to each other and we say, this is what's working. And Newton won because his explanation worked better than any of the older explanations.
So it's not that the gravity itself is socially constructed, but our conceptualization of it is definitely something that arises out of our language, how we talk about it, the process by which we investigate it, that type of thing.
Yeah, the table is hard, and it'll hurt if you bang your knuckles on it. But it, our sense of what is a table, and what is that? What should we call the feeling when you smash your knuckles against it, and so on? That's all socially constructed.
I'm glad you acknowledged that, this idea could be threatening to people. I mean, your career has basically been investigating people's fears, and I can see where, for some folks, just saying the word social construction is already going to bristle them and create a certain stereotype in their mind of what you're really after, or you got some agenda. This is clearly not what you're trying to say at all. Could you just speak to somebody who has that fear for a minute?
Yeah, I don't have an agenda. I'm trying to understand the world better, and I think we understand the world better if we recognize the part that human beings play in defining the nature of the world and making the world meaningful. We have to do this. We do it all the time. It shouldn't be scary to point it out.
That makes sense. I was very interested in the implications your book has for the idea of fact checking, right? Fact checking sounds like, a helpful, handy thing. Those of us who remember kind of the early days of the internet probably remember that it was kind of fun when you heard or read something that just sounded crazy. You could go to Snopes.com and find out if they'd fact checked that and whether or not it was true or not. But as you note, people have become fearful and suspicious even of the enterprise of fact checking. So can you tell us, A, who tends to have these fears and suspicions? B, what exactly do they suspect is happening? And then C, what are those fears and suspicions founded on? What are they founded on?
Well, I think who tends to have these fears is pretty much everybody. I don't, I'm not somebody that thinks that all of the lunacy is on one side and all the sanity is on the other side. We all get anxious. We all make mistakes, and you have these efforts. A pretty famous one is PolitiFact, the Washington Post fact checker. These have been around for, I don't know, 20, 40 years now. And they are efforts, by journalists to use the standards that journalists use to, make judgments about the accuracy of various claims that people make. Okay. And, if you say something that is pretty demonstrably not true, the Washington Post will give you 4 Pinocchios, and PolitiFact gives you pants on fire, and so on and so forth. What's happened is that you get people who have political agendas who don't like the answers that the fact checkers are producing. Okay, and it's probably not true that they don't like any of the answers, but they don't like some of the answers because some of the answers strike them as biased. And so you now have websites that are devoted to conservative fact checking, and other websites that are devoted to liberal fact checking. And both of them, are happy to attack the fact checkers in the middle for, the standards they are using aren't correct, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is it's easy to understand how this is debatable. Okay. A politician makes some statement that may be 3 or 4 sentences long, and when it gets fact checked, very often the fact checker zeroes in on some very specific aspect of it and says, well, I can check this. And part of the problem is they can't check everything, but they can check this. I can check what do the unemployment statistics say, or whatever it is, and people will have the reaction, well, yeah, but that isn't, saying that politician's statement was pants on fire wrong. That aspect of it, maybe that wasn't quite right, but really the larger statement had a truth. I mean, you can see how this is going to go. Okay, when you're it isn't possible to just go out and say, here's a fact, I'm going to check it, and it exists in no context at all. All of these statements have context that have to be addressed.
With polarization, alternative media sources, competing fact check organizations, as you were just talking about, I can imagine people being afraid that, well, that just means we just can't agree on facts anymore. We're just doomed to fight over the most basic claims about the way things are. I found it really interesting in your book that you actually write legitimate fights over facts are actually relatively rare. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I think that, we miss all of the things that we take for granted. Okay. If you think of all of the cultural knowledge that each of us carries around, we share it, the great majority of it we share with other people. Okay. And, we share the time of day, and so on and so forth. And so while we tend to focus on the things that people are disputing, that makes perfect sense. That's why we have fact checkers, because, there are, statements that people make, and the fact checker says, I wonder if that's true or not. Most of what's we agree on is not controversial. And it's easy to overlook that. We get so caught up in which team we're on, in what the current meme is, or whatever it is, that we forget the larger cultural background that we share.
I guess that's true. Like, people aren't screaming on Facebook about whether smartphones will make a phone call, or right, or whether turning the keys of your car will start it, or
yeah. I mean, there are just a host of mundane examples. we count on the other drivers to drive on the right side of the road, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Let's stay on this theme in your work of social fears that might be far less warranted than people think. But I want to pivot to how you uncover this in other issues. So let's talk about your work on the American education system. And I want to start by reading a short blurb. Quote, American schools are failing. Our students are ill-prepared for the challenges the future holds, and they may even be the dumbest generation, unquote. Now, anyone listening to that quote might think I was describing the way things are now in 2025, but you investigated the merits of that idea in your book, The Stupidity Epidemic, that was published in 2011. In that book, you argue this is a story we've been telling ourselves about our own schools and children for a long, long time. So how do you explain that?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting. If you trace this back, the idea that people will say, and, adults love to say this, that, hey, school was tougher. We really had to learn stuff back in the day. These schools today don't have any standards, et cetera, et cetera. The earliest example of somebody saying that I came across was from the 1840s, okay, which was right around the time that states started making public education mandatory, okay? So this has been an ongoing theme. If you get to 1900, people are saying, American schools are rotten. The schools of Germany and England are vastly better. In the 1950s, when I was in school, they were saying it was the Russians, it was Sputnik, and oh my God, the Russian schools are vastly better. They're going to eat our lunch. 30 years later, it was the Japanese. The Japanese were going to eat our lunch. Today, it's the Chinese that are going to eat our lunch. And in each case, there's this anxiety that we're not doing enough. And what's really remarkable is if you think about it, if all of these critics have been correct, then we have been getting steadily dumber for 180 years, okay? And at the same time, Americans invented, like the airplane, and we sequenced the genome, and we did all this stuff. And it's remarkable that we're so much dumber, and yet we're accomplishing so much more.
So what did you find out about this story? Is it true? Has there ever been a period where we had a stupidity epidemic?
No, of course not. Of course not. If you look at all the statistics, it's very clear. The graph for proportion of the population that graduates from high school, okay? Proportion that graduates from college, okay? Proportion of kids that are taking AP courses, all right? It just gets better and better and better, okay? And what we do is we say, well, yeah, but that kid at the convenience store couldn't make change right, And that's a sign that everything's really going to hell in a handbasket. And, what is the evidence? This is a strange thing, but there's something in psychology, maybe you'll study this, called the Flynn effect. And the Flynn effect is that IQ scores have been going up, okay? And they've been going up for a long time. They've been going up for 100 years. And now IQ scores are not a perfect way of measuring intelligence, but they are a way that we use to measure intelligence. And the average IQ score has been going up. Now it's always been 100, okay? But they jigger the numbers each year so that 100 is simply what the average person is doing. But if you ask how many questions did they get right on the test, the number of questions they get right goes up a little bit every year.
Yeah, as I understand, I read the Flynn effect a long time ago. I want to say in one of Steven Pinker's books, maybe it was Better Angels.
Oh, it's Stephen Johnson.
Well, so if I understand that right, like they adjust what counts as 100 because of this like constant climb, which would mean that like our 100 now would be the equivalent of like maybe even what would be judged to be severe mentally disabled 100 years ago.
Yeah. Now that does not mean that your grandparents were stupider. Yeah, your grandparents knew different things. Okay, I at one point in my life had a kind of primitive understanding of how to use a slide rule. None of my students in the 21st century has any idea how to use a slide rule. Is that a sign that, intelligence has declined? No. It's just, we value different kinds of knowledge.
Boy, he's not going to make this generation is so much worse off than us, and not going to make those folks very happy.
Not helping this nostalgia crowd.
I will say I'm kind of at the age where sometimes I see a little bit of that creeping in, and I have to check myself and say, wait a second. There are a lot of things that I needed to know when I was, in high school that people who are in high school today, they don't need to know that. It's not relevant to their lives, right? We don't teach typing, in classes anymore for a reason.
But your smartphone skills when you were in high school probably weren't all that great.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
and probably today, you're like me and you turn to a younger person whenever something's not going well. It's safe. How do I make this thing work?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I've got 5 kids to help me with that.
Yeah,
so they keep me up to date. Well, let's talk about another social fear you've worked on, what's termed random violence. And again, let's introduce the idea with a quote. You say, quote, "We fear the carjackers, the sexual predators, the drive-by shooters, the strangers who attack without warning or provocation. We fear sudden, unexpected, undeserved chaos, pointless suffering at the hands of brutal barbarians," unquote. That quote, as you point out, describes a fear of violence that is patternless, pointless, and perhaps worsening, in other words. Random violence. So, like that last issue, I bet people listening to that will think we're describing how people feel right now. But your book, again, Random Violence, was published in 1999. And you write that our fear of random violence shapes many of our reactions to contemporary social life. And you argue that throughout the book that fear of violence that is patternless, pointless, and worsening is not a good thing. Why? Everybody knows violence, crime is just awful, and we're living in the worst time ever. And if I step out of the door, I'm going to get brutalized by somebody. How can you say this?
We have a lot of evidence on this point. The FBI has been measuring crime, and it's an imperfect measure. Any measure is going to be imperfect. But the FBI has been, measuring crime rates since the 1930s, so 90 years. And we know that the crime rate peaked about 30 years ago, okay? And it's been going down, okay? Now, I discovered when I was a professor that when I was reading blue books or term papers or whatever, students would say, well, crime is going up, okay? And they would say that when the statistics showed that crime was going up, and they said that when the statistics showed that crime was going down. They said that after I'd given lectures telling them that the crime rate was going down. There's this kind of constant pessimism that runs through American culture. Our glass is half empty and it's probably leaking. It's everything is just getting worse all the time. And it's not, okay. And everybody does this. This is a rant that conservatives make, but it's also a rant that liberals make. The world. And, we've seen a lot of progress, okay? Basic thing, life expectancy. Life expectancy has boomed. Levels of education have boomed. Access to the vote has expanded. Standard of living has risen dramatically, okay? Now, these are all what you might think of as kind of bedrock social indicators. How's life going? Okay. And they're all getting better. They're a lot better. Okay. And we should know that. But at the same time, we insist on telling ourselves, well, this is things are bad and they're getting worse. Okay. And to some degree, this is exacerbated by the way that we've organized communication in our society. People hearken back to a happier time when you could turn on Walter Cronkite and Walter Cronkite would tell you the truth, okay? And it was very straightforward. And what's happened is we have democratized the media in astonishing ways. The first way was, cable television. When Walter Cronkite was operating, basically there were three networks that were eating up 90% of the audience in any given hour, right? And so if you were ABC or CBS or NBC, you were trying to get 30 plus something percent of the people to watch your show, okay? And they would all be around 30%, okay? What happens when you get cable? All of a sudden you have dozens, hundreds, I have no idea how many stations my current cable package contains, certainly hundreds of stations, right? And so what's happened is instead of broadcasting to try and make everybody, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, buddy, and sis, everybody, bring them into the audience, what you're now doing is you're narrowcasting for people that are, going to want to look for particular kinds of content, and you're going to be able to sell stuff to those people. So maybe they like golf, and you give them a golf channel. Maybe they have a religious faith, and you have a channel devoted to people of that faith, people of that ethnicity, people of that political slant, whatever it is. All of these audiences are tiny, okay? A major TV cable news station is pulling in probably less than 3 million people an hour, okay? Walter Cronkite would have been fired if he was getting 3 million viewers a night. He was getting, 20 million or 30 million or whatever it was, okay, vastly more, right? And what's happened is we've created all of these different platforms where people who share particular interest, concern, can inhabit together, and they can reassure one another that you're in good shape. And then, of course, what happens next is we get the internet, and the internet does this on steroids, so that now you have billions of places that you can go on the website. I looked up a curiosity porn this afternoon, and you're not the first hit.
That's why we aren't getting the traffic the right way.
I'm going to have to talk to Santiago about that. That's clearly his responsibility out there.
Awesome.
But if you want to believe in the flat earth, there are other people. There always were people who believed in the flat earth, okay? But now you can find them, okay? Walter Cronkite was not going to treat flat earth beliefs seriously because, if he did that, he'd risk losing 28% of the 30% of the people that he was trying to attract. Now, people are perfectly happy. If you can get 2% of the population watching your show, you're doing great.
To stay on that pessimism theme, you've done work on a lot of other social panics as well. You've got a book, Threatened Children, that talks about the ways that we grossly exaggerate and distort the nature of kidnapping threats to children. And you also talk about the connection between that problem and the satanic panic in your co-edited volume entitled The Satanism Scare, published in 91. I have to bring those up because regular listeners to this show will be shocked that I did not try to make this entire interview about the satanic panic because James and I have a perennial interest in the history of the satanic panic. But I want to leave those issues aside because I want to give you a chance to talk about something I'm guessing you're quite passionate about because you've written 3 books about statistical literacy. You have one called Damned Lies in Statistics. There's another one, More Damned Lies in Statistics. And then there's Stat Spotting, a field guide to identifying dubious data. I'm guessing that you think statistical illiteracy is at least partly to blame for why we develop so many unfounded social fears in this country. First of all, do you think that's right? That greater literacy in that regard might have prevented or mitigated some of what you've written about. And from there, can you just give us some examples of how statistical illiteracy led to people really being duped or just ended up mistaken about a social issue?
John Allen Paulus wrote a wonderful book called Innumeracy years ago. And he makes the point, I'm probably going to, mangle this a little bit as I make it. But, there's a basic principle which you do not learn in your mathematics classes, that all large numbers are equal, okay? When we get to a million, a billion, trillion, people's eyes glaze over, okay? And they treat these as a lot, okay? There's a lot of this, or there's a lot of that, or that, et cetera, et cetera. And you have numbers that get thrown around that, you can understand how this happens. I started writing Threatened Children because it was really a book about the missing children problem, which was a very big deal in the 1980s. That's when you had kids' faces on milk cartons and all that kind of stuff. And there were people who were saying there are 2 million missing children each year. Okay, 2 million children go missing. And, once somebody prints something like that, then everybody else is free to print it and to say, yeah, see, everybody agrees there are 2 million missing children each year. Now, the Denver Post would eventually win a Pulitzer Prize for debunking this and pointing out that, there was really no basis for this statistic. What happens, another better example perhaps, was there was a guy named Mitch Snyder who ran a homeless shelter in Washington, D.C. And, and this is during the Reagan administration, you had people saying all the time, there are 3 million homeless in the United States. And Schneider, when somebody finally asked him about this, and he said, because he was really the source for this figure, he said, well, yeah, we guessed. I talked to some people, and he says, yeah, it's a big problem. 3 million is a big number. It must be about right.
Seems about right.
And the Reagan administration was arguing at the time, correctly, that the actual number was closer to 300,000. Okay, and people were just outraged that the Reagan administration would try and minimize the problem. Now, you can't make this. If I tell you that, I'm going to bring some people with me over to your house, and they're either going to be 3 or 30 of them, and we're going to expect you to feed us. Okay, you recognize right away that 3 and 30 are very different. Okay, when it comes to taking, providing a meal for people. Well, that's the same difference. 30 is 10 times 3. 3 million is 10 times 300,000. Okay, but people have this idea that, well, what difference does it make if it's 300,000 or 3 million? They're really the same. Okay, so we don't think very hard about a lot of these things, and numbers come out. And once somebody has a number, you can seize upon it, and you can repeat it over and over again. And you can find this again and again and again. One of my favorites was that anorexia kills 150,000 people every year. There are 150,000 deaths due to anorexia. And this is a number that I tracked it. It first appears here, and it first appeared in an interview with Karen Carpenter's doctor, and Karen Carpenter was a pop singer who had been anorexic and who died, and he said, well, this is a serious illness. It can kill you, and we guess there might be 150,000 people who have anorexia. Now, watch what happened right there. He didn't say there were 150,000 deaths. He just said there are some people who die, and there may be 150,000 who are sick. But that gets transposed into, there are 150,000 deaths each year, and it gets repeated again and again and again. Now, if you thought about this for a second, if this is back in the day, if you picked up the World Almanac and looked at it, you would have realized that probably can't be true. Because one of the things we know is that most people who experience anorexia are relatively young, and they tend to be overwhelmingly female. Okay, so how many young women die from anorexia each year? How many young women die? All right, let's define a young woman as 15 to 45. Okay, which will strike some people as silly, but when you get 46, you start appreciating that. And
I appreciate that you included 45-year-olds in the term young, very much so.
well, yeah, exactly. And it turns out, and let's take all the deaths of females in that age range. Now, that's going to be automobile accidents. That's going to be deaths from breast cancer. You get the whole 9 yards. Okay, there are 50,000 of them. What are the odds that 150,000 of those 50,000 are suffering from anorexia? We don't spend a lot of time thinking critically about the numbers that start.
Let me get my slide ruler out. I'll figure this out.
There's two things there I want to touch on that's so important about statistical literacy. The first thing that you said was that people interpret it. So let's go back to the accusation that when the Reagan administration rethinks this 3 million number goes to 300,000, people said oh my gosh, you are minimizing this very important issue. And that just strikes me as wait a minute, you just implied in that breath that you just think 300,000 people wouldn't matter and we shouldn't care about that. Well, I bet those 300,000 people want you to care about that. That sounds crazy to me. That adjusting the number to be more accurate would mean that you lack concern about it or something, which also means in the same breath that you think we should exaggerate these numbers because that means you care or something. And that just sounds very bizarre. Now, in the case of the missing children, that 2 million number just strikes me as weird because I'm just thinking how many children we got? Eventually, aren't they just all missing?
That was a very good point. In the good old days when they were tossing that around, there were 60 million children that'd be defined as under 16 or under 18. I've forgotten what it was. Okay. So 2 million of 60 million would be 1 in 30. That would mean that every single third grade class in the United States would have a missing child each year. Every second grade class would have a missing child. Et cetera, et cetera. And you stop and think about it for a minute. You realize that can't be right. I don't remember a missing child from my third graders class last year. So it was obviously wrong. And what was worse was that they would typify this with terrible examples. Okay. So that, a child is kidnapped and then later murdered, something like that. And there were various celebrity cases, Eton Pates and Adam Walsh and so on that became the exemplars of these of this problem. Well, the typical missing child is a 14-year-old girl, okay, who gets into an argument with her parents and they won't let her pierce her ears. And she gets real mad and she goes out of the house and slams the door and she goes to her best friend's house and she stays there 2 nights and she doesn't tell her parents where she is. Okay. And then she comes home. Okay. Was she missing? Oh, okay. I don't know. But she isn't being murdered. She isn't being kidnapped. She isn't being beheaded. All the terrible things that we think about. And so, a lot of times when we talk about social problems, what we do is we take the worst, most hideous example, and then we couple it with a big number, okay? And the whole idea, if there were 2 million missing children, it included all the runaways. Okay, that's the 14-year-old girl who can't pierce her ears. Okay, and when we typify runaways, we typify it, girls to get on a bus and go to the Minnesota Strip and get turned out by pimps. Okay, and this is, we're not good at thinking about what social problems are like. We're not good at thinking. We can think about what the worst example of being homeless is, or the worst example of being a missing child is, or whatever, and then we get a big number attached to it, and we're not really thinking about, well, what else is included in that big number.
I can see too where, the Adam Walsh case is especially tragic in a way, right? Because number one, this really happened to somebody like Adam Walsh. That's horrible for John Walsh. It's perfectly understandable why John would make this his mission in life to try to make sure this doesn't. That's noble of him. But when it gets coupled with that number, you can see where well-intentioned people who want to write very effective policy get sidetracked into thinking like that's representative of the problem. And so we need to be pouring all our resources into cases like Adam Walsh, when that's probably a fraction of 1% of all the kids that are missing. And it really is a problem, say, when we've got like non-custodial parents nabbing up their kids or runaways or that kind of thing, where that would require very different intervention strategies and different kinds of attention. And that means we are literally redirecting resources away from the larger problem because of that kind of statistical illiteracy. Would you say that's right?
Yeah. The basic rule of thumb is the worse the case, the less common it is. The more mundane the case is, the more common it is. You just see that with absolutely every social problem.
As a political scientist, I follow interest groups and interest group behavior some, and there is a huge incentive for finding the largest number you can find for fundraising purposes, for resources to address the issue, and not just with interest group, with agencies as well. Because if I can make the problem bigger, I can get a bigger budget and do more things. And so if you say things are improving, it's almost like, well, what's the point of having you around? That doesn't seem like a win to these folks. The win is making sure people think the problem is ongoing and is as bad or worse than it has been, regardless of what the underlying reality is.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Well, okay, let's switch gears, because anyone who is familiar with your work would be shocked if we made it through the entire interview without asking you something about the work you're most famous for. You are basically Mr. Halloween. Is that a fair assessment there?
I tell reporters that I am the world's leading expert on poisoned Halloween candy.
Well, okay, yeah, we're talking about every year there's these rumors that Halloween candy given to trick-or-treaters, you know what's going to happen? There's going to be a razor blade in the apple. There's going to be drugs and poison in the candy bars. This is an urban legend that continues to this day. This is not like old news. I even found, I decided to go hunting, and I even found that one of the California State Universities still maintains a public safety notice put out by the police with tips for checking your children's Halloween candy. And I found out that at least as recently as 2019, there were still clinics and hospitals offering free X-ray services for children's Halloween candy to check for potential dangers.
I'm actually surprised by that because the radiologists, there were articles in radiology journals warning hospitals against X-raying treats because it wouldn't identify poison. Okay. And there was the idea that, you could be X-raying and okaying treats that were actually contaminated. And so a lot of hospitals have backed off. Yeah, no, I was in graduate school at the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. And this was really becoming, a public concern. And I thought I was going to specialize in deviant behavior. And one of the things I was doing is I was reading a lot of books by autobiographies by thieves and drug addicts and people like that. And they were not very interesting books. And one of the things that you realized when you read them was that these people all had reasons. You might not think their reasons were good reasons, but they could explain to you why they stole things or why they used drugs or whatever. And I started thinking about this Halloween poisoning and stuff. And I thought, I cannot imagine what the reason for that is. And I started just kind of floating this idea with my friends. And I said, I don't think this is real. And they were just outraged. They said, of course it's real. Everybody knows it's real, et cetera. And, so I got a job and I started teaching. And I would say to the students, I'm not sure this is real. And the students were just outraged. Of course it's real. And so it finally occurred to me that and I'm thinking, how do you study this? And I finally thought there was a good way to study it, which was to get I started with the New York Times, okay, because the New York Times used to publish a big, thick index every year, and it was a terrific index. If you had a one-sentence article in the newspaper, it would be indexed in that index. So I could look up Halloween, and then I got criticized that, well, New York Times is typical. So I wound up looking at the L.A. Times and the Chicago Tribune, and that was, we had an East Coast city, a Midwest city, a West Coast city, three biggest metropolitan areas. Took the leading newspaper in each one and looked at 25 years of news coverage, and just and it was easy for the Times, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune. I had to get microfilm and actually go through the newspaper.
Microfilm.
And I went through
Microfilm. That dates you a little bbit.
I did it for November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And I figured if you didn't have a case reported by November 3rd, it wasn't happening. And it turns out there aren't any reports of this. Okay. There'll be a report that says, oh, somebody found a pin in a candy bar, but fortunately no one was hurt. And there weren't any stories. There were no stories of people dying this way. There was a guy in Texas who murdered his son, and he poisoned the kids' Halloween candy, and he figured, I think, that the police are just overwhelmed by all of these reports that they get about poisoned kids, and they'll never suspect me.
Wow.
And it worked. For about a day. This was a big news story.
24 hours that bottom.
It was in the Times, the Tribune, the LA Times. Everybody had this story, and then, like 2 days later, the police realized nobody else had any poisoned candy in this was in Texas, and the dad had purchased some poison. I've forgotten what it was, rat poison or something, and they eventually arrested him. He was tried. He was convicted. It being Texas, he was executed. Okay, never owned up to it, and but I don't count that case, because when people say to me, do I need to worry about this? They aren't worrying about, are they going to murder their own kid? They're worried about, is somebody down the block going to do it? Okay. So I eventually got this published, and I put a piece in Psychology Today, which was a medium-sized important magazine back in the 1980s, and that got me an interview on the Today Show, and so on and so forth. And I was off to the races, man. I have been doing this. This is a seasonal job. Every year it's like October 15th, and I'm thinking, well, maybe this is the year it dies, because I haven't heard anything. And then whambo, the calls will come in, and I'll get a dozen calls. In 2022, which was the great rainbow fentanyl scare, I got like 40 calls, but that was a very atypical year, and it just lives on. And I understand how this works. Some poor reporter gets assigned to do a story on Halloween safety, and so they don't know anything about Halloween safety, and so what they do is they go to LexisNexis, and they see what people wrote about Halloween safety last year. And there's a pretty good chance that in those stories I'm going to get quoted. And so they call me back up, and I've been given the same interview since 1984.
That causes me to question, why do you think this urban legend has such sticking power? I mean, even in addition to your work, there have been others who have written very popular pieces about how unnecessary our precautions are. And I can only assume that people like you have to keep doing this year after, you just said so. You have to keep doing this year after year because the fear continues to be prevalent enough to demand that articles be written and interviews be given. So why does this keep circling around?
Well, especially, can I add into that? Because we're not still scared of what was there, like a killer clown fear a few years ago? Rainbow fentanyl is not a thing anymore. There's a lot of these like urban legend fears that die. This one just will not give up the ghost.
Yeah, well, everybody knows it's true. And there are contemporary legends that are hundreds of years old, that people have been telling. It's a good story. That's the most important thing with the contemporary legend is it's a good story, and it also it is a tremendous thing to be worried about. Okay, if you're going to have a fear, this is the one to have, because here's the fear. You fear that somebody down your block is so crazy that they will poison little children at random. But they are so tightly wrapped, they only do it one night a year. Okay. And so you can, if you're worried about this, you can say, well, I'm not going to let the kids go trick or treating. I'm going to take them trunk or treating in the church parking lot. I'm going to, we're only going to the houses of people that we know. I'm going to go with them. At a bare minimum, when they come home, I'm going to go through all the treats and inspect them. Whatever, little ritual you want to have to protect your children. And, I'm in favor of, taking care of your kids. And then, November 1st, you get around the family around the breakfast table and you count noses and everybody's still there. And you can say to yourself, we don't have to worry about that for 364 more days,
I'm sure it doesn't hurt the staying power that it is around a holiday that comes around every year. And it's a holiday that's designed to scare us anyway. And so...
Well, it's dangerous, right? The other thing is, if you look at emergency room admissions, there are more emergency room admissions for Halloween than any other holiday. 4th of July comes in second. Because this is a night when we send tens of millions of kids out into the dark, okay, and they, and they trip over their costumes and they fall down and they get tangled up in stuff and they get hit by cars and they aren't being poisoned by maniacs, and those safety tips that you get, the National Safety Council and all these organizations will produce a list, and it'll say, make sure your kid can see through the mask. Don't let your kid wear a flammable costume. Don't let them carry an open flame. Be sure and inspect the treats. It's all good advice. I didn't inspect the treats, but I'm not sure that my wife didn't.
Well, this has been amazing, but we have one more question that we ask all our guests, and we consider this the most important question that we like to ask people. We have a lot on the line for the two of us.
Well, you do.
Well,
I'm
all right.
so far ahead.
No, that's true. That's true. Okay. So suppose, thought experiment here. Suppose that after this podcast recording, you left, but you had only two options for how to spend your time. You could either watch an episode of Seinfeld or you could watch an episode of 30 Rock. Which of those two would you choose?
Well, I don't watch a lot of network TV, and so I have never, ever seen 30 Rock. And I think I've only seen 2 or 3 episodes of Seinfeld. So I don't know, maybe I'd go to 30 Rock just for something different. I don't know.
Oh, 2 out of 2 of my top 5 dream guests have now chosen 30 Rock, James.
He's climbing back into the rankings.
Yes, this is our perennial debate, which is the better comedy of the two. And I am squarely Team 30 Rock, and he is Team Seinfeld.
I'm actually a Mary Tyler Moore guy,
Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
We both grew up with those reruns. I remember watching that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I hate to tell you, but I saw him on live TV. You know.
Our guest today has been Dr. Joel Best, Professor Emeritus from the University of Delaware. Wonderful guest. Thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Thank you so much for being here.
A lot of fun.
And we will see everyone next time.
See you folks next time. Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the two best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.